So I am going to try to just plow all the way through and just finish today. I've got quite a few things to do. I need to post all of your videos. We will have, I'll have the test ready by noon tomorrow. It will be available for you from noon tomorrow till Wednesday night. I think that'll give you enough time to review the videos if you feel like you have to, and give you enough time to take the test. Things are starting to stack up. We're moving into the end of week 3 and we have a couple of weeks to go. So I'm trying to make sure we're staying ahead of the ball game. So we have 2 sections left on how we go about establishing a strategic focus. Bless you. And then how we go about developing our competencies. And so without further ado, let's move in. So the strategic focus takes the SWOT analysis and it takes and integrates all of those things together into a strategy based upon whether you have positive strengths and weaknesses or positive opportunities and threats. And so the strategic focus we're going to have is how do we implement these things and what style of strategies are we going to use in order to implement them. And so we have 4 different ways in which we classify these. And so the first is an aggressive strategy, where you have many external strengths and many external opportunities. We'll explain these one at a time too. Diversification, where there's many internal strengths, but there are also many external threats. A turnaround strategy, where there are very many internal weaknesses, but many opportunities outside. And then finally, a defensive strategy where you have internal weaknesses and external threats. And so without further ado, let's just move right into the first one. So an aggressive strength scenario is the best of all. You're in a particular market with great expansion and growth. You're coming out with new products in new markets. And you have this ability to reshape the entire competitive landscape. Now, one of the things to note about Apple and all of these things as well is that Apple is a 2-sided solution. That the hardware is one side of it, but it's also the software that generates and uses it on the other side as well. And one of the things that always makes the iPod, the phones, and the iPads so powerful, and the MacBooks as well, is that quite simply, you can upgrade the software to do all sorts of new and unique, interesting things, especially if the software takes advantages of products, or let's just say pieces inside the hardware that are there to be taken advantage of, okay? You can reshape the competitive landscape in a first mover advantage by being able to just simply change fundamentally the direction of everything. So once again, the iPad fundamentally changed the direction of everything by, in essence, becoming the first mover advantage and setting the strategy for the expectation of what we want in a tablet. Now, I got into this thing, oh gosh, in the 2010s, where I was actually using and buying $30 and $20 tablets that were running Android, and they ran perfectly fine. The big difference on those things were that they were just running with inferior screens. They were great, but the fact is that the screens that they were using just simply couldn't match the iPad, okay? So an aggressive strategy with many opportunities means that you can fundamentally change the landscape. I think iTunes is one of those things that came along And quite simply, there were others out there that were doing those things, but iTunes kind of shoved everything away. Now, one of the strategies within the Apple environment is that they believe in a closed system. And so what that means is that they only trust the members inside of that group. They do that for fundamental reasons. The biggest one is that the cost of movement to another platform can be way over expensive. And so the Apple becomes a great barrier entry if you're willing to live within the system of Apple. I think that AI is going to change a lot of things. Anyway, my idea. So the aggressive strategy, positive, everything is great. Diversification. You have a corporation that has a lot to offer, but there are external factors out there that are fundamentally changing, especially in the legal market and perhaps even society as well, that is blocking your pathway to success. What this means that you have to do is you have to find a way of diversifying new products, new markets, but then also maybe a different thing that you're doing. So in North Carolina, which is predominantly the tobacco industry, which has led this growth in this market, you had companies like Philip Morris, RJR, that were out there that realized in 1992 to 94, when they came up with the, oh gosh, let me think about it. What was it called? The tobacco settlement. The tobacco settlement, basically the tobacco industry accepted that they took responsibility for smoking causing cancer. And so they ponied up to the United States the total tune of about $565 million. But what this also realized is that there was a fundamental generational change going on at the same time, in that people were moving away from smoking. And so Philip Morris and RJ Reynolds said, what do we do? So Philip Morris looked at the market, came up with a few things, one of them being smokeless tobacco, because one of the things that consumers said they hated without exception, and especially those around them, is the fact that smoke eternally got into everything you wore. So like when I would go out to a bar in the 70s, I would come back smelling of smoke, and I didn't smoke, all right? So smokeless tobacco was one thing. However, what they also realized is that RJ Reynolds was that they had a great system. They had success. They knew how to market well. They prioritized their strategic business units. And RJ Reynolds went out and bought Nabisco. And so RJ Reynolds became RJR Nabisco, and now are one of the number 2 or 3 sellers of consumer goods next to Procter & Gamble and Johnson & Johnson. I think they're somewhere in there. And this is all because of their ability to recognize that external factors were going to block future growth no matter what they did. You find that once they also did this, they found that they were pretty good, Philip Morris was, at doing other efficient things. So they got into power plants and aircrafts and real estate. Because if you remember when we talked about what is the thing, one of the powers that you have is organizational excellence. And that's certainly what RJ Reynolds and Philip Morris had. And so diversification, this is what you do when you have lots of strengths, but you have large threats in the current market that you're in. Turnarounds are those organizations that have many internal weaknesses, but great opportunities. Some of these come into excellent and outstanding brand names that come along that had for years led their industries, but because of bad management and improperly looking in the future, made mistakes. And yet, there's still firm ground out there for them to make a success. So J.C. Penney basically stepped on their own foot. J.C. Penney in the 2000s decided they had to remake their brand image, and properly so. I mean, J.C. Penney was known as the grandmother's department store. But truthfully, the primary market for J.C. Penney was professional women between the ages of 35 and 50 who made anywhere from 65 to 150,000 a year. It was a very professional women's place to go. So the brilliant guy at Apple who came up with Apple Maps was brought over, boy, was that a bad one, and started changing fundamentally J.C. Penney. They started creating department islands within the store themselves. They started to cater to a much younger group. But the problem is that they were leaving their strategic base behind them, and it was a complete and total disaster. J.C. Penney had to close multiple stores. They had to reorganize. And yet, however, they still had this core fundamental base. If they could just get it back, they could do something with it. GNC, which is General Nutrition Center, had the very same problems in that they grew simply too fast. Okay. And the problem with GNC is they overbloated with stores. And of course, when it comes to vitamins and nutritional things that they sold, you started to see places like CVS and Walgreens starting to take and shave part of that away. And yet, that nutritional agency is still just as valid as ever. And so what you did is you had companies coming in and buy the bankruptcies and try to turn these units around. And so a turnaround is for when you have many internal problems, but there are opportunities out there to be had. And so you organize yourself to be able to take advantage of it. And then finally, the fast defensive strategy is when you're overwhelmed by internal and external problems at the same time. Radio Shack, sadly, was one of those organizations that made bad choices. And if it were actually out there now, they say that this is external problems right now. I think Radio Shack could be poised for regrowth, and you can actually find Radio Shack out there online. Radio Shack, originally the word came from the place on a ship where you actually had the radio transmitter. It was called a Radio Shack. Radio Shack in the 50s and the 60s were for the real do-it-yourselfers who like to put electronic breadboards together. You could find diodes and all sorts of pieces. I worked for Radio Shack for 5 years. The computers came along. Radio Shack was one of the first systems. They had the Model 1 that came out. They gravitated to the Model 4. They put themselves on, it created, or put them out with an IBM PC compatible. And then cell phones came into existence, and Radio Shack decided they were going to invest everything that they had in cell phones, and they exploded. But the problem with the cell phone industry is it rapidly matured. And for anybody who knows what it's like to get a cell phone, especially the first time contract, it would take 30 minutes to an hour to sign up somebody in those traditional stores, which usually meant that somebody who just wanted to come in and buy a few pieces would generally be ignored because the cell phone was going to generate much more income for Radio Shack. Well, what happened is once the industry matured, you saw places like AT&T and Verizon opening their own stores, and Radio Shack was left holding the bag and lost big time. Radio Shack 2 years ago re-entered on the internet, and so they've put their presence out there again. So how do you come back if you have lots of internal problems and you have hopefully opportunities out there. Success in many weaknesses comes in focusing whatever you have left on a niche market that you can be successful at. And so if you go to the Radio Shack website, they're focusing back on their niche market, one that they did well. They ditched the mall because the malls in the United States have been ditched. And they're finding that particular niche once again to survive it. Going back to diversification, if I have strengths but limited markets, then it's time for me to find new markets. I mentioned this before with Pepsi. Pepsi gave up trying to pursue Coke. They had excellent organization and they diversified into fast food industry. They bought KFC, they bought Pizza Hut, they bought A&W root beer. Interestingly enough, though, they didn't buy A&W root beer, the beverage. I have no idea why, okay? And they bought Long John Silver, started the fusion stores, spun off WOW, and now they're just doing absolutely great. Great organizational structures with organizational excellence can do anything. This isn't going to be a test question, but if I were looking between operational excellence, product leadership, and customer intimacy, I would take operational excellence anytime. You know, I think if you look at Walmart, I think Walmart has this as well, that their ability, their supply chains are second to none. I'm not sure if I talked about this. Do you know Walmart does not have a single dry truck out there for dry shipping? In 1998 to 2004, Walmart decided there will never be a single truck that they have moving across the United States with nothing in it. And so what they did was they set up a series of regional warehouses across the United States and invested in their computer systems heavily so that every truck that Walmart has on every road always has something in it. And that is an example of operational excellence. Okay. The last way, or another way of being able to see where you are and how to take advantage, is what's known as a strategy canvas. So a strategy canvas is a way of visually showing your strategy relative to others and give you an idea where to focus your marketing strategy towards. And so this looks at the airline industry overall, and it's looking at 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 different points that consumers use when they're trying to decide, you know, what they consider to be the better offering. And so the strategy canvas, if you look at it, you look at Southwest Airlines, you're talking about the regular just driving to a location, and then you're looking at other airlines. If really what you're wanting to focus on is between our competitors, we're looking at these two curves here. Now, we find that Southwest pricing is low, which is great. Their opinion of meals is bad. Their lounges are no good. Their seating choices basically come down to whatever. But there are things that it does pretty darn well. They're known for being very friendly, and their speed is second to none. I would also put in here as well the baggage, because that's become even bigger than ever, because Southwest allows you to carry as many bags as you wish. And this is a way of looking at the structure itself and deciding, how do I go about crafting my brand message? And for them, friendliness and speed are the two things that separate it from its competition. I should also say frequency of departures as well, even though that doesn't show up on the other airlines. I think on that one, what you have to do is try to find out, because they're actually part of different booking agents, and that's why you probably can't find that information correlated together. So, strategy canvas. So we have all of this information. We're talking about choosing one of the four focuses. Now let's talk about how do we craft objectives and goals, and what are the differences in between. So first, let's relay the ground rules down. Goals and objectives are consistent with each other, but for the purposes, especially for the individuals in the corporation, they're separate. Goals are what are considered generally accepted accomplishments, and I'll talk about that in a minute. Objectives, I have always stated, are specific, quantitative, and they gauge progress, which means that objectives have to be benchmarked usually to some period of time out there, okay? So let's talk about the four considerations when we're talking about goals. You're going to find a few of these to be there in objectives, but they're going to be slightly different in the way that we find them. So attainability as a goal, it must be realistic. Realize that goals are what you use to motivate employees. That's what a goal is for. If the goals that you set are unrealistic, they can be very demotivating. We're a startup company and we're going to be beating Google in 2 years. Basically, what happens is that the normal rank and file in your corporation thinks you're out of touch. The expectation of the employees is that it's unattainable, job performance suffers, and the goal that you want to do is you want to motivate your employees towards better performance, so that has to be attainable. You can say something to the fact is, we want to have the finest engineering company in the business. That can be a statement, but notice that it's vague as well. The definition doesn't necessarily have to be measurable against other corporations, because you can define that yourself. You have to be consistent with your sales and the market share that you're in. Same as customer satisfaction as well. Now the second bullet I would give a little, I don't know, I would disagree somewhat with OC. I do believe you can reduce inventory and increase customer satisfaction, but that's an argument, okay? What they're basically saying is that if the customer doesn't have the goods on the shelf, then you're not going to sell to them and they're not going to be satisfied. I get that, okay? But just goals across areas need to be mutually supportive. We want to satisfy customers and we want to have the fastest delivery times. Those would be consistent goals. And both tend to be somewhat intangible. So it should span across the functional areas of the organization, so that each functional area should be able to develop their own goals, supporting the firm. It needs to be collectively exhaustive across all areas of the organization. Research and development doesn't have to be just only for product development. Research and development on promotion is a great way to spend money. Research and development in supply chain is an outstanding way to be able to increase efficiencies and shorten lead times. Walmart's sole, maybe not sole, but I would say all of their strategy comes from the single central point of a super efficient supply chain. They've proven that you can have an enormously large employment base, 1.6 million employees in the United States, 1 million rest in the world, 2.6 million employees. They can have that many employees and still be efficient. You do not have to cut workers in order to be able to achieve profit. So they've been able to do that because they spread their goals across the entire length and breadth. And as I've said, they have to be intangible. It's an outcome that the organization hopes to achieve. And it is reasonable within it to be flexible enough so that it can be framed in a motivational way so that the individuals in the organization feel like they can get up every day. And let's just say these things are tied to their bonuses. They feel like they've got a shot, they've got a chance. So these are goals, all right? The best trained sales force. Number one engineering firm. Creative advertisement campaign. These are what goals are. Objectives, different side. They are specific and measurable quantitative benchmarks to gauge progress. They need to be attainable and have continuity across the organization as well. Those are two parts, things of what goals are, that they can be attainable with a reasonable effort. And what this also means is that your employees are not spending 4 nights a week at the office till 10 o'clock. That's not attainable because it is unrealistic for your workers to be spending 80 hours at the office. Now, unfortunately, this is not always true. American workers are the most efficient workers in the world. American workers generally as a whole work 65 to 70 hours a week. We know this for a fact. We try to find ways to give American workers time off, but work, all right, it is part of our nature. And if we start declining in the number of hours we work each week, I'm not sure how successful that's going to be. In Asian cultures, in Japan, it is perfectly acceptable to fall asleep at your desk. As a matter of fact, it's socially desirable. But it doesn't always work in the United States. So there needs to be some kind of flexibility in this reasonableness. And I think right now we're redefining it. Your generation is much more open to non-monetary compensations than my generation. In other words, yeah, it's great if I get time and a half to work extra, but look, I want to have 3 days off so I can go do something else. So if I were to say to you, I'll give you 4 days a week if you work 10 hours a day, it is much more likely in your group that you're going to say, that's good, let's do it, okay? So flexibility in organizations is important. Continuity also means that the last objectives that you have, you build on to the next objectives. Okay, so what you're doing is you're building stair stepping, one in front of the other, in front of the other. So you pick up where you left off and you continue upward and you remember where your path is. And the last two I consider to be the most separate differences between goals and objectives. And that is that you have a time frame that you occur within a certain time and that you assign responsibility. Who does what? Because it improves the accountability and the outcomes. And here's the other thing, folks, you got to clearly spell these things out. It has to be in the contracts if you have to write them about what someone is supposed to do. So like I sign a contract every year. I sign a contract just for doing this class. And the contract explicitly states what my expectations are as a teacher. And so time frame and responsibility, I think if you're going to look at them, these are the two that separates everything. So the last parts of this, in getting goals and objectives to work, these things don't just happen because you hope they work, okay? You have to set in motion a series of operational decisions, and you have to serve as a catalyst to get these things moving. And that's the other reason that you find individuals and you take names, write them down. You set rewards because that's what reward power does. And at the very last, what you hope to do is set coercive power. You hope to use referent power as a way of being able to pump up the individuals that are below you, have it desirable for them to wish to follow you around, and have the expectation of norms within the organization so that they always know you're behind them. They always must lead to the establishment of consistent goals and objectives to each functional area of the firm. And as I say functional, I mean marketing, I mean finance, I mean accounting, I mean operations. This is what functional areas mean, okay? They have to all work together. And each of these areas must next determine the means that will lead these things to the firm. How do you have that? You have cooperation. You have to have good leaders. This is just a side point. In leadership psychology, we have three types of leaders. We have the transactional leader, we have the transformational leader, and then we have the charismatic leader. The transactional leader is the individual who simply says, you do your work today and I'll pay you. Transactional leaders are the most fundamental. It's the one you see in films in the 40s and 60s. Charismatic leaders tend to be those large people in organizations that lead from the very top. Steve Jobs, Elon Musk. Charismatic leaders have their difficulties because they don't necessarily translate those things to the people below. The best is to be a transformational leader. And what you do is you motivate the individuals in your organizations, you give them jobs, and you turn them loose. It's the scariest thing of all if you're a leader. But if you want to develop leadership, that's how you do it. Okay, so this chapter is about SWOT analysis and how to use it, how to translate the SWOT analysis, getting that information together, tabulating that information, using synthesis to understand what our strengths and weaknesses are, determining those strengths and weaknesses are, what should be our strategy, how to take that strategy, form goals and objectives. From here, this is how we create and build the marketing plan. Okay. So when we come back next week, we'll be back in our groups again. We're going to go through an actual case. We're going to develop a SWOT analysis using these tools, and I'll talk about the case strategies and what we'll be doing in our last 2 weeks. Okay. All right. Let you go early. Y'all have a great weekend. Okay. Bye. You bet. Weekend, man. We'll have a party. It's Boone. Boone's going tomorrow. Boonerang, excuse me. Boonerang Saturday. We didn't plan on going driving all day.
Father's Day